Hello there, I'm Steve from Mac84, and welcome to Vintage Apple Basics Part 2. If you've missed the first one, click the link in the corner or down below. But essentially, the whole purpose of this series is to get you familiarized with these vintage Macs. They're a bit quirky, and they're unlike a lot of the PCs or older systems that you may have experienced before. There's a lot of tricks to get these things up and running, and I'll be happy to share those with you today. A huge thanks to everyone who watched the first video in this series. If there's something you want me to cover in a future video, please leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for future updates. Today I'll be addressing some of the most common issues you'll experience when trying to get some of these old Macs up and running. Generally speaking, this advice is for systems that were made before 1999, however, some of this knowledge applies to some of the later PowerPC models. We'll be covering a number of topics today, including identifying your Macintosh, connections and cables, power on and startup, and lastly, floppy drives and disks. And in the next video, we'll focus on all things SCSI. First things first, you have to identify what vintage Macintosh you have. Sometimes that's easier said than done. Thankfully, there's a bunch of helpful online resources that'll help you easily identify which Mac you have. Some of them can have similar names and styles, so it never hurts to confirm your assumptions. For example, we have this Macintosh LC. Well, it's actually a Performa 430, and that's because Apple labeled and marketed systems differently across different markets like education, home, and business. However, there are a few identification marks that'll still make this easy to understand what's inside. On all Macintosh computers, there's a serial number, and that's usually on a barcode style label like you see under the lip of this Macintosh. You could use a website like everymac.com to decode that serial number and to find out more information about the year of the system, what operating system it could support, and the type of processor and memory that's inside. Depending on the case of the system and how lucky you are, there may also be a label with the specific name of the Macintosh on it, although sometimes it's just a generic label. This says Macintosh LC2, and we have a model number here as well. However, Apple is notorious for reusing model numbers, especially in the Intel era, so that serial number is your best bet at identifying the exact computer it is, unless somebody swapped the case on it. Swapping cases is not as uncommon as you may think. For example, the early Macintosh 128K and 512K were often upgraded to Macintosh Plus systems. They would often retain the front of the case, which looked like an older Mac, but the back would be different to accommodate the new I/O ports. Oh, and just ignore the second floppy drive in this special Mac. I did a whole video about that. Other upgrades may be invisible unless you dig into the computer. This is a processor upgrade card for a Power Macintosh 6100 series, and you wouldn't know the system had it unless there was a label on the front or you peeked inside. Generally speaking, it's a great idea to open up these computers, especially if they're in an unknown state before you turn them on. You can make the problem much worse if you have something going on inside that machine, like corrosion, leaky capacitors, or an exploded PRAM battery. I did a whole video about this topic, so be sure to check that out in the corner or the link below. Now let's talk about connections and cables. You'll also want to make sure you have the right accessories, cables, and peripherals for your vintage Mac. Some of this stuff may look similar, but you don't want to go plugging something in just because it looks like it'll fit. You'll need to educate yourself about the different ports and signals and the different accessories that are compatible with different models. For example, this is an early Macintosh mouse. It is only compatible with the 128K, 512K, and Macintosh Plus models similar to the one I have here. It uses a 9-pin DB connector similar to a PC serial port. However, all later Macintosh computers of this vintage use an ADB mouse, and that stands for Apple Desktop Bus, and it has a little 4-pin mini DIN style connector. A lot of third-party manufacturers made input devices like mice and keyboards, so you don't have to go with an Apple one if they are a bit more expensive. Just make sure it's really a Macintosh compatible accessory. I've seen a lot of mislabeled Mac accessories on eBay that clearly had PC PS2 style connectors and not ADB ones. To illustrate this point, let's play a bit of a game. I have 3 25-pin style connectors on the edge of these cables, although only one is a real SCSI cable that I could plug into the back of this Macintosh. Which one is the right one? Well, first off, this one only has a few pins, so that can't be a SCSI cable, because a SCSI cable has 25 pins, at least in this variety. There's a lot of flavors of SCSI. It gets a bit more confusing with these two cables, however, because they both have 25 pins. However, let's look at the other side of these cables. Here's the other sides of the cables. Now, for those of you uninitiated, these are two serial style ports, and this is the end of a SCSI connector. It just goes to show that some things may look the same, but they're actually different. To make this a bit easier, all Apple cables have a part number molded into the plastic, so you can look up that number to identify what type of cable it is. These Macs usually came with some sort of documentation or user's manual. But 40 years later, people are not usually hanging around with those pieces of paper. Thankfully, a ton of them are archived on places like the Internet Archive, and you could do a simple web search to find a manual for most of the Apple products that are of this vintage. However, there are some common things that are explained in those manuals that are expected knowledge if you're dealing with these systems. Unfortunately, today people just pull electronics out of boxes and push a few buttons and expect them to work without worrying about if they're going to plug something in wrong or so on. But this era of computers is a little bit different. So for example, we have this floppy disk drive. It has an Apple logo on it, so you might assume, well, this works with a Mac because this is a Macintosh and this has an Apple logo on it. Well, you'd be wrong. This is an Apple II floppy disk drive. Apple never shipped a 5¼ floppy disk drive for Macintosh systems, and although the plug is identical and it will fit in your vintage Mac, the signals and voltages are different, and if you plug it into a Mac, you could risk damaging both the disk drive and your Macintosh computer. To add to this confusion, some later 3.5-inch floppy disk drives were compatible with both Macintosh systems and Apple II systems. On the Apple II, those disk drives can be daisy-chained to plug in multiple disk drives to one Apple II system. On the Macintosh, you can't do that, so if they shipped those drives with the Macintosh, they actually put a plastic plate over that area to discourage you from daisy-chaining those drives. Thankfully, most of this information is in the manual or documentation that's shipped with your computer. These are available online, so do a web search for the name of your Macintosh computer and something like Manual or User's Guide, and you should find the documentation applicable to your system. For you old school Mac heads, yes, Apple did ship an Apple 5¼ PC disk drive that was meant for PC compatibility. However, that disk drive looked different and required a special card. The only instance where you may be plugging in an Apple II disk drive into a Macintosh is by using the Apple IIe card. This was an add-on card for a select series of Macs that used a special cable coming out of it that split the connectors and allowed you to plug in an Apple II disk drive into that system. Power on and startup. Before powering on your vintage Mac, you want to make sure it's in good condition, there are no surprises inside, and that you have the right power cable and any adapters necessary. Some of the hardware aspects of this video may be more related to desktop Macs, as the Macintosh Portable and the PowerBook line of computers do differ slightly. Let's talk about power supplies for a moment. These convert the electricity that comes from your wall outlet to a safe voltage for your computer. However, like all things, they age and they don't last forever. One thing to note is that I'm specifically talking about machines here in the United States. Other systems in other countries may have voltage switches or other things you want to be aware of, and later Macintosh models like Power Macs may have a little red voltage switch. If you're in the United States, you want to make sure that's set at 115 or bad things can happen. Power supplies like these, or the analog boards that drive the voltage on vintage all-in-one computers like the original Macintosh, are unique things that require extra special attention. While generally speaking, logic boards can take any capacitors or replacement components that meet those requirements, power supplies or switching power supplies may require specific components or replacements for components that are no longer made. I'm not an electrical engineer or anything like that, so I'm not going to pretend to know all the ins and outs of a power supply or how these things work. However, it does not stop me from being safe when working on these things. That goes for any of this stuff. If you're uncomfortable or don't feel right when you're opening something up, stop, pause, and do some research on the subject. If you feel more confident proceeding forward, go ahead. If not, it may be a good idea to ask somebody else who's more knowledgeable about the subject. One thing I do want to mention about power supplies is REFA capacitors. You may have heard of these before, but these are safety film capacitors that are designed to filter the electricity that comes in from the outlet before it goes through the rest of the power supply. Unfortunately, with age, the surroundings of these capacitors can crack, and when they fail spectacularly. These components aren't getting any younger, so the risk of these blowing is higher and higher as the years go on. Thankfully, they are fairly simple to swap out, and in most cases, although you may want to check on this, you can just clip them out and you likely will be okay. However, I always replace them just because these parts are not expensive and it's a fairly trivial process to do so. This particular power supply for an Apple II has two reefer capacitors that are fairly visible in this area. However, they can differ in size and shape. This power supply, on the other hand, has about 6 reefer capacitors in it depending on the model. So yeah, some of these may have more of a potential to blow than others. A reefer capacitor exploding may blow the fuse on the computer, but it likely won't harm it, although it may give you a bit of a scare.
Whoa, 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 whoa. That's the reefer cap. Hey, it blew!
Assuming your power supply is okay and you have the right power cord, turning on these old Macs is quite simple. You just locate the power switch on the back and flip it on. However, later desktop Macintosh computers, starting with the Macintosh 2 and other models, introduced something called soft power. Soft power allows you to turn your Macintosh on via the button on the system, like the button on the back of the Macintosh 2 CI right here, or the special button on the keyboard. That's this button right here with the triangle on it. Some PowerBooks and all-in-one Macintosh computers have a slightly different startup procedure. For example, on the Macintosh Color Classic and the Performa 500 series, there is an on-off switch on the back, similar to the original Macintosh. That switch has to be turned on, and then you have to use soft power to turn on the system. If you don't have a keyboard, you won't actually be able to turn on those systems. This is often why you see a lot of those systems for sale as is or not working, because somebody may just assume they have to flip the power switch and they don't see anything happen and they think the computer is broken. If you can't power your Mac on via a keyboard, you might want to try another keyboard cable or another keyboard. If that doesn't work and pushing the button on the computer fails to turn the system on, you may have an internal problem that is preventing it from working. Some soft power Macs also have an interesting feature. The power button can be rotated 45 degrees with your fingernail or a small screwdriver, and this will automatically let the computer start up in the event of a power failure. Thankfully, this is easily undone by just rotating that power button. Finally, there's batteries. These PRAM or clock batteries help your Mac retain some system settings and the time when it's turned off or removed from power. However, these are rarely required to use your Mac. Sadly, these highly corrosive batteries are the #1 cause of early death in these computers. All vintage Macs have a battery in one form or another, and most of them are locked away inside of the case, meaning you may be in for a nasty surprise when you buy a vintage Mac secondhand. To make matters worse, some of these batteries are soldered onto the logic board, meaning you'll have to clip them out to remove them. On those models, it's basically guaranteed that nobody has ever removed the battery from that system. If you have an old Mac with one of these batteries in it, even if it was replaced just a few years ago, get that battery out. There's no reason to keep it in there, and no matter how trusting you are of that battery brand, time makes fools of us all. Here's a few batteries I've been very lucky removing before time ran out, and here are some unlucky examples. This battery is so corroded it's fused to the plastic holder. Modern adapters and ingenious remote battery solutions let you retain the clock settings or have the battery when you need it without the risk of these ticking time bombs in your system. Sure, select Macs in the Mac 2 and LC series may need a battery to turn on or display video, but in those cases, a coin cell battery and adapter is not only cheaper to use, but the safer choice. So be sure to remove those batteries from your vintage computer and never store them with the battery inside. The risk far, far outweighs any benefits. Startup and death chimes. When you power on your vintage Mac, you should hear a happy startup chime. Some people call this a bong, but essentially it's a confirmation noise that says, hey, I'm powering up and everything seems to be okay. However, there is a good possibility you may hear a different sound. This is a different tone, and there are variations of this depending on the problem and the system. However, the important part is that the computer is telling you something's not quite right. 9 times out of 10, these are usually memory-related issues. The memory management of each of these systems is a little bit different. Sometimes if memory modules aren't seated properly, or if they're in the wrong order, you can cause the computer to complain that it's not able to detect the memory correctly and it won't fully start up. You may also hear these noises when there's more serious hardware issues like corrosion or damage to some of the integrated circuits. Earlier Macs have two buttons that are on the system. These are sometimes referred to as the programmer switch or the reset and interrupt buttons. Essentially, one of these buttons restarts the computer, and the other one could be handy when programming software for the original Macintosh. Some of these buttons require optional accessories to push through the case and push them, like on the original Mac and the Macintosh SE. Now these buttons are made of plastic, so if you don't see them, they could have just broken over time. Thankfully, there are a lot of 3D printed versions out there to replace them. This Macintosh 2CI does not have those buttons, but this Quadra 650 does. On the Macintosh 2CI, I could easily just open up the lid and I can manually push the reset button or the interrupt button. You likely won't be using the interrupt button, but the reset button is a handy feature. Startup keyboard commands. You could also reset most Macintosh computers from the 90s by using the keyboard. You hold down the Control, Command, and push the startup key on the keyboard, and this will restart the system. If you've done this correctly, you should hear a startup chime. I'd also like to show you some of the other helpful keyboard commands that every Mac user should know. Some of the more obscure ones I won't mention here, but I'll put a link in the video description that should cover most of them. Keep in mind, some of these may not work on the earliest Macintosh systems. Here are some helpful startup key combinations. These keys are pressed immediately after you hear the startup chime when you turn on your computer. Holding down the Shift key will tell the computer to start up with extensions off. Extensions are pieces of software that control add-on cards, peripherals, and other things plugged into your computer. They also enable applications and other system software features. Sometimes these would conflict with each other and cause your computer to freeze on startup. Holding down the Shift key when starting up your computer tells it to start up with all unnecessary extensions turned off. This can be helpful at getting you to the desktop, where you can then turn off extensions manually, or use a piece of software like Conflict Catcher or Extensions Manager to manage which extensions you want turned on or off. Holding down the C key immediately after the computer starts up will tell it that you want to boot from a CD-ROM drive, or a blue SCSI acting like a CD-ROM drive. This could be very helpful if you want to boot into an operating system, install CD, and erase a hard drive or so on. On later PowerPC-based Power Macs, you could hold down the Option key at startup and you'll get this little friendly boot picker where you could select which drive you want to boot off of. Most of the time you'll be dealing with a SCSI hard drive connected to one of these vintage Macs. Each SCSI device has an ID number to differentiate it across the SCSI bus. Sometimes these ID numbers can be a bit annoying because your computer may want to boot from a SCSI device that you don't want it to boot from first. Thankfully, you could use the SODA command to reverse the order of what it's trying to boot from. SODA stands for Shift Option Delete Apple. Most people call the Apple key the command key, but in this case, SODA makes it a bit easier to remember. In some instances, you could also hold this down plus a number of 0 through 6 to designate which SCSI ID device that you want to boot from. Holding down the keys Command, Option, P, R will reset the PRAM of the computer. The PRAM stores the time and other system settings. Resetting the PRAM is a go-to solution for a lot of quirky Macintosh problems. It's always a good idea to do it just in case, particularly if your system is acting strange or something just doesn't seem to be sticking right. It might not solve the problem, but it doesn't hurt to try. You will have to hold down these keys a bit longer, however, because you have to hold them down until the computer restarts again. So you'll turn on the computer, hear the startup chime, hold down Command Option PR, and continue holding them until you hear the computer restart again. You could also do this for one more chime or two. It doesn't really hurt, but usually once is enough. If an application locks up or your Mac seems stuck, you can try and force quit the current application using Command Option Escape. However, this should only be used as a last resort on these vintage Macs. It's not the same as it is on the modern Mac OS today with proper memory protection and so on. Here, a failed force quit will often bring down the entire system, forcing you to restart your Mac and losing any unsaved work. Happy Macs and question marks. When you turn on your Mac, you should see something on the screen. Now, we're going to skip anything related to analog board or weird geometry type issues here, but we're going to focus on the icons that the Mac will display to tell you the status of its startup. It may take a minute because the Macintosh has to check all of its memory, but after you turn it on, you will either be greeted with a Happy Mac, or you may be greeted with the floppy disk icon with a little question mark on it, or on later Macs, this is replaced by a folder icon with a question mark. This is the Macintosh's way of telling you, hey, I can't find any system software to boot up from. This can be solved by putting in a floppy disk or starting up from a hard drive. Since this Macintosh doesn't have a hard drive built in, we'll have to use a floppy disk. And you'll see that question mark will turn into a Happy Mac, as long as the disk is okay. If you see a disk icon with an X over it, that means the disk can't be read or it's not a compatible disk for the Macintosh. And you'll know it doesn't like this disk because it'll spit it out. Sometimes you may see a message on your computer saying that this startup disk won't work with this Macintosh. What that generally means is either the Macintosh is not compatible with that version of the Mac OS, either you're using a version that's too early or too late for it, or the version is technically okay, but it's not the right disk for that particular model. You see, some models came out after a system software update or release and did not have the necessary software to be compatible with that newer Macintosh. To fix this, Apple had what they called system enabler files. These are files that sits inside the system folder of the startup disk, which helps the Macintosh software understand the capabilities of that new Macintosh and make sure everything is compatible. Thankfully, it's a simple process to add these system enablers to a startup disk or a hard drive, and there's a compatibility list online that I'll share in the video description that'll help you out if you're running into that problem. Then there are edge cases like this. Here I'm using a System 7.0 boot disk on a Macintosh Classic 2. But the message is saying this Mac isn't compatible with System 6. This is because the Macintosh System 7 boot disk uses a small System 6 folder to start up the installer. Since the Mac Classic 2 can't boot to this version of the OS, it will display this error. The Macintosh Classic 2 shipped with System 7.0.1, so System 7.0 install disks will not work. Instead, you'll need the specific disks for that version. Thankfully, if your vintage Mac can boot into System 7.6, you could use the Apple Legacy CD. This bootable CD has tons of handy software and system installer disk image sets, including everything from System 5 and earlier through macOS 8.1. It even includes model-specific install sets for the PowerBooks, the Classic 2, the Performa series, and much more. Even if your Mac is too old to boot from the CD, you can use another Mac or an emulator to use the system installed disk images from the CD. My friend Bruce from Brankus Creations has an excellent video showing you how to create bootable hard disk images using a Mac emulator on a modern computer, so I highly recommend you check that out. And remember, if you don't have an old Mac CD drive, you can use something like the Blue SCSI to boot from CD images. No matter if it's an old Mac like this or a more modern Mac, you want to make sure you always shut it down properly by going to the special menu and selecting shutdown. You don't just want to turn the power switch off or rip out the plug. In this situation, we still had to turn the switch off on the back of the computer because it was not a soft power Macintosh. So those Macs with a built-in screen usually have a toggle switch on the back, like a Macintosh Color Classic or a Macintosh Performa 550, 575, and so on. But what happens when things don't go according to plan? Well, instead of a happy Mac, you'll get a sad Mac. This is obviously the opposite of a happy Mac, and nobody likes to see a sad Mac. When this happens, the screen will turn black, and you'll see a sad Mac icon in the middle of it, usually followed by a row or two of numbers and letters. These numbers and letters make up a code that tells you what it thinks the hardware problem is. Most of the time, this will be related to memory. This could indicate that there's a problem with one of the memory chips that's soldered onto the logic board of a compact Mac, or there could be a problem with one of the chips or the modules that's seated into the socket of your other Macintosh computer. Basically, you want to inspect those machines carefully to make sure that everything is seated properly and that there are no signs of corrosion or damage. Some sad Mac codes can be related to software if you're not using the correct system disk, or there could be a problem with one of your add-on cards. Essentially, you want to take out anything that is not necessary for the computer to start up, any add-on cards, any extra memory, or anything else plugged into the system that doesn't have to be. Once you're back to basics, if the problem goes away, then you know that something is wrong with one of the add-ons that you plugged in. If you're dealing with these compact Macs, there's a great book that you should look out for. You can find free copies of it online. It's called The Dead Mac Scrolls. This book has an extensive list of sad Mac codes for these compact Macs and other early Macintosh computers. These codes can differ between devices, especially PowerBook computers, so you just want to keep that in mind. However, this book also has a plethora of information about servicing and fixing up these compact and early Macintosh computers, so I certainly suggest you check that out. I'll put a link to it in the video description. When the computer first turns on, you should see a gray screen that has perfectly square edges. As the computer goes through its startup process and reads the ROM, those square edges should become rounded and you'll see a cursor in the corner as well. Then you should see the little flashing question mark with the floppy disk icon, and this tells you the computer has completed its startup process. If there's already a disk to boot from, it'll change to a happy Mac and you'll be on your way. If I'm repairing a particularly damaged computer and I see those corners become rounded and the cursor come up, I know I've made some good progress. Now if you already have a hard drive plugged in or installed on the computer and you still see that flashing floppy disk icon, that could mean a number of things. It could mean that the hard drive is dead or failing. It could also mean that something has become damaged or corrupt and the system can no longer find the appropriate software to start up the computer. Of course, I strongly recommend you back up your old Macs as well. Even if they just have some old personal files or games on it, you don't want to have to start from scratch. This is fairly easy to do, especially if you have something like a blue SCSI. Those SD cards are pretty inexpensive. But I would also recommend you back up the data on those SD cards to your desktop computer or a cloud service because nothing lasts forever. Although there's a special audible charm of using the original disks inside of your computer, if you're getting that flashing question mark and you have one of these original hard drives, there could be a number of issues that you could be experiencing. Unfortunately, that's beyond the scope of this video. There could be a number of hardware or software problems with these disks, and some of them are getting up there in age. But if you're just starting out or you just want to turn on easy mode, I would strongly suggest you pick up one of these blue SCSI version 2s. This version 2 desktop model costs about $30 to $50 US, and that depends on if you want to assemble it yourself or have it pre-assembled for you. It uses a standard SD card, and you could just put disk image files on there, so you don't have to worry about any special formatting. This makes it very easy to put on different disk images or CD images and play around with your software or games without worrying about the limits of your old hard drive or if it wants to last another year or so. If you do want to blast from the past and want to use an old floppy disk to boot up an old Mac, that's fine, no one's going to stop you. However, there are a few things you need to know. Different floppy disk types and formats are compatible with different types of Macintosh computers. The original Macintosh 128K and 512K used 400K disks. These were single-sided floppies. The 512K-E through the Macintosh 2 series used 800K floppies that were double-sided. Apple later upgraded some of these systems to be compatible with 1.4 megabyte floppies. These are likely the standard format that you are used to if you have dealt with any floppies in the past. So how can you tell the difference between some of these disks? Well, some of them will be clearly labeled, others may not be. On 3.5-inch floppy disks, the notches in the corner will give you a clue. If there's one notch, this means it's a single or double-sided floppy disk. If there are two notches, that means it's a high-density or 1.4 megabyte floppy disk. You could format an 800K double-sided disk to a 400K single-sided disk because it's only reading one side of the disk and the other side will be ignored. There are tricks to get a 1.4 meg disk to work in 800K disk drives, but I don't really recommend that. Floppy disks are pretty cheap, and if you're going to be using something that could only read floppy disks, your best bet is to get something like a floppy MU or a similar product, because then you don't have to worry about failing media and aging drive heads and so on. Making bootable floppy disks is a topic we'll cover another time, but you'll need a vintage Mac in order to make 400K or 800K boot disks. These can't be written on a PC without specialized hardware. USB floppy drives, either used on a Mac or a PC, cannot write anything but 1.4 megabyte high-density disks. This is due to the hardware nature of how older disks were written. If your floppy disk drive is making a lot of weird noises, it may be failing to eject or read the disk correctly. A few common issues with these drives are simply old dried up grease, so the eject mechanism won't work properly. There's also a small gear that helps the motor eject the floppy disk, and unfortunately these gears turn to cheese and no longer work. Thankfully, replacement gears are sold, and the process to replace them isn't that hard. You will want to identify the type of floppy disk drive you have, as the repair solutions differ depending on the model. Remember to also clean the heads of the floppy disk drive. Cleaning your floppy disk drive will usually solve the problem of you being unable to read any disks. You could use a special cleaning disc which has a cleaning pad inside, or you can use a cotton bud with some isopropyl alcohol on it to carefully wipe away any dust or dirt. Just be very careful to never forcefully push the head mechanism up or down. This can easily damage the drive beyond repair. I'll link to some helpful videos below that'll detail the cleaning process. That's about it for part 2, but the whole purpose of this series is to educate newcomers about the Macintosh and how things work in the vintage Mac world. Hopefully this video has inspired you, but if you have questions about anything that we've covered today, or future topics you'd like to see, please leave a comment down below and I'll be sure to try and include it in the next video. But that's about it for now. Please consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll catch you right here next time on Mac 84.